Number 1. Someone was definitely in my house. I was maybe around 13 to 14 years old at the time, and I was recently granted the privilege of staying home alone. Every now and then, when I was home alone, I'd hear sounds coming from upstairs, so I would instinctively call my mum. She then told me a story of how she used to hear things in her old house all the time, and how it's just the house settling in. Fast forward to many instances of sounds later, I decided that the very next time I was going to be home alone, I was going to be completely silent and make as little noise as possible. Within the first half an hour, there was nothing, not a peep out of the entire house. I eventually got bored and felt safe, so I went to go grab the TV remote to watch some TV. But a few seconds before I grabbed the remote, I heard a huge crash upstairs and running footsteps. I was sure more than ever that someone was in the house. By now, there were plenty of consistent sounds coming from upstairs, that it was a fact that someone was upstairs. 14-year-old me decided to hatch a quick plan. Being the skinny, most non-threatening little girl that I was, I first grabbed a kitchen knife. Then I grabbed a shoe and propped open the front door. And after a few moments of some deep breaths, I yelled out in the deepest voice that I could. "I know you're upstairs. I'm giving you a chance to leave without me calling the police, but I have propped the front door open and I will be in the bathroom. Be aware that I'm holding a knife, and if you refuse to leave, I will call the police." Sure enough, I walk into the bathroom with my knife, absolutely scared to death that someone will open the door. I wait and I wait, until the one sound that to this day will always scare me for this reason. I heard the front door close, and the shoe that I used to prop open the door was moved. I quickly locked the door and turned on the alarm system. I hope to never see this person or even hear this person ever again. Number 2. I just came back from dinner with my mum, and we talked about something that happened literally 20 years ago. And while we did, I thought it'd be a good story to share on here. Now, before I can jump in, I need to sketch the surroundings a bit. At that time, my mum was 43 and I was 18. Also, our relationship wasn't the best. Admittedly, that was pretty much my fault. I was a rebellious teenager then, and important for the story, I was caught up in the metal scene, among other things being the vocalist of a black metal band. Those inhuman screeches. It's actually a trick. Next to that, I picked up a liking for weed. My mum stood out less in attire and manners. Although, and yes, this is important too, she likes the color blue, and she had long blonde hair. Behind our own house stood a house owned by social services, an organization that provided sheltered living. So, in that house lived 3 men, Abe, Bart, and Carl. Abe and Bart were obviously in need of help, but completely harmless. Carl was, even in that company, special. Not on first sight. He was rather a diminutive guy who dressed well. But well, if people are really detached from reality, you just have to look at their eyes to know. Now, Carl might have been heavily medicated, and he was still batshit crazy. I don't really know what was the problem, I'm not a psychiatrist, but in a nutshell, he suffered religious delusions and was convinced that some people were angels, demons, or characters from the Bible. I didn't know that, but in hindsight, let me give you a rundown of how I looked when I returned home from a show. Long hair, a beard, rather muscular build, a black frock like monks wear, studded leather belt, and arm bracelets, with a big pentagram around my neck, and I went full out corpse paint. So, in short, after seeing me walk around like that a few times, And hearing the frequent arguments my mum and I had, Carl became convinced that I was a literal demon. And here comes the catch, that my mum was the Virgin Mary, blue clothes, long blonde hair, remember? And he thought that I wanted to abduct her into hell. But he was using his medication, and he wasn't a danger to anybody. Until, on a hot summer day, I got a visit from the police because I had gotten in a fight. So what did my mum do? She invited the cops to sit at the yard while they talked to me. To Carl, that was somehow the straw that broke the camel's back. The cops leave, and I succeeded in convincing them that I just happened to be near the fight, and my mum and I started to argue. And at that same moment, Carl starts skipping his medication. And a week later, I have a show in a neighbouring city, so around 3 a.m. I return. Because I wasn't that stupid, I didn't drink or smoke before getting in my car, but I was planning on doing that afterwards. And in the car were two of my bandmates, Andres and Quinton. I go inside. My mum is fast asleep, and I get a few beers while they sit in the garden. Smoking had to happen outside, and it was pretty hot anyway. We sit, chat, smoke, drink. All is great. Until Carl decides to act. "What the fuck?" said Andres. He pointed at the hedge at the end of our garden. All three of us, intoxicated by then, watched Carl, dressed in a white gown, with an aluminium circle on his head, wrestle himself through the hedge. "What do you think you're doing, mate?" I said. "Be gone, forces of evil," he shouted, waving at us with a rather large cross, like as long as my arm. At that moment, I admit we didn't know what to do. If you think about it, he probably took our shocked looks as a sign that his cross worked. So he runs to my open back door. My clue to run behind him, screaming at him to stop. He enters my house, shrieking that he's coming to save the Virgin Mary. Now it gets weird. My mum wakes up from all the shouting. She wore white PJs and had her hair loose. Carl must have thought that she descended from heaven, so he bolted up the stairs, falls to his knees and starts praying. The three demons behind him are strangely enough not repelled. I grab him by his scrawny neck, totally ready to go medieval on him. I mean, we had our problems, sure, but this was my mum we're talking about. He jumps up, wrestles himself free, and manages to hit Quinton in the head with the cross. Andres and I back up, look at each other and nod. Carl is going down. "Stop," says my mum, as loud as she can. She walks up to Carl, takes his hand and says, "I think you're seeing things wrong." He looks up to her and starts crying. I mean, ugly bawling. He tells her that he wants to protect her from the demons. My mum says, I know, but that really isn't necessary." I whisper to Andres to call the police downstairs and stay there. "Look, he's just a kid that likes to dress himself up. He's not a demon. I don't really like it either, but it's a game." She motions at me and I lose the frock, the belt and stuff. That stuff was heavy and it got hot. Underneath, I'm only wearing my boxers. I wish I had a picture. Carl is still on his knees crying. My mum is standing before him smiling. Quinton, in full garb, is sitting against the wall, holding his head. And I'm standing in my boxers. I mean, you don't have to be crazy to get confused by that. Carl takes a deep breath. "But you're the Virgin Mary." "I'm a nice lady," she says, "and that's my son and his friends, and you're Carl. It's all okay." He looks at me, then at my mum, stands up and grabs his cross. He looks at his cross and then says, in an almost childish voice, "Didn't I tell you?" After which he makes his way downstairs, through the garden, through the hedge, and back in his own place. Somewhat later the cops show up. We explain everything, and the next day, Carl moved out. That was the story about the man I don't want to meet again. But this is the scary part, and how I know that my mum is, underneath her appearance, very brave and smart as fuck. To conclude, 2 days later, his social worker paid us a visit, telling us what happened in Carl's mind leading up to that night, repeating over and over again of how happy she was that we were unharmed. I, by then, my usual bragging teenage self said, "I would have dealt with him." The social worker shakes his head. Apparently, Carl told him that he didn't only have a cross, he also had a large kitchen knife under his gown. Number 3. The sweet old lady that's our neighbour turned out to be very creepy. To keep it brief, when I was 17, my family and I lived in a rural town in Australia. We moved into a relatively isolated neighbourhood, but about 50 to 100 metres next door lived a single old lady. When we moved in, she seemed nice enough and introduced herself, etc., etc. She always seemed a tad nosy and asked a lot of questions, but I put it down as what lonely old people do. She seemed sweet, or so I thought. One day, on school holidays, I was home alone and making a sandwich in the kitchen. I look out of the window over to her property, and through her bedroom window, I thought I saw a figure in the distance, but it was hard to tell. For some creepy reason, I got my binoculars. I was bored, alright? So I looked over, focused them, and my heart sank into my chest. My mouth dried, and legs shook with shock, as I realized she was staring directly at me. After a few seconds, she made a massive grin on her face. I shut the blinds, told my parents, but they played it off, saying that I must have not looked properly. But that's not the creepy part. The night before we set out to move, my father was in the Air Force. I finished playing around on my PC before going to bed. I woke up to rustling sounds outside. I got freaked out when I realized it wasn't merely creaking sounds in the house. With frozen courage, I peeked out of the blinds ever so slightly, and to my horror, I make eye contact with the old lady directly outside of my window. My body froze and she started quietly laughing, not moving her gaze at all. I shut the blinds, panicked, and shouted for my parents. The three of us searched the outside of the house, but nothing. My dad confronted her and she acted like the phony sweet old lady that she was, with dementia. Thank God we moved out the next day. As we packed our things, something in the back of my mind told me that she was watching me from afar, and it still sends shivers down my spine. I still have paranoia, trouble sleeping at night, and bad dreams. I try to justify it as mental illness or dementia, but it still scares me even though I'm 22 years old. Sometimes I imagine the same old lady outside my window, even though I've moved across the country. Number 4. About 7 years ago, when I was 17, my parents went out of town for a weekend and left me at home. This was a pretty common occurrence. My parents trusted me. I would usually spend these weekends away, staying with friends or family, as my parents' house was a bit creepy to be in alone, even during the day. We live in a small rural town where everyone knows each other, and generally it's pretty quiet and safe. Saturday, I was supposed to stay with a friend, but her parents decided at the last minute not to let me stay. It wasn't a big deal that I had to leave. I was somewhat prepared to have to go home, because her parents got weird about company sometimes. I left her house, which is about 15 minutes away from my parents' house, around 9:30 or 9:45. While I was on the way, I got a weird feeling that I can't really explain. I just knew that I didn't want to go home and stay at my parents' alone. I called my brother and asked if I could stay with him. At the time, he was living with a woman who had a small child. He told me it would be quieter and easier for him to just come and stay with me at home. since his dog would bark if I tried to come in the house. He said he would be at our parents' house in 20 minutes. Side note that's relevant later. My brother's a relatively scary looking guy. He's about 6'3", 200 pounds, pretty muscular, and covered in tattoos. After hanging up, I decided to stop at a gas station and grab a snack before going home, so that my brother would be there when I got there. I pulled into the gas station. There were only a few cars in the lot, which is typical because this is a small town in the rural south where everything pretty much stops after 8 PM. I parked and walked up to the door. There was a man standing outside the door smoking. He opened the door for me without saying anything. This is normal southern hospitality, especially since I'm a female, so I smiled and thanked him. Inside, there was another man standing by the door. I noticed him staring at me as soon as I came in. He gave me that gross, up and down look and said something to the effect of, "Hey sexy, what are you doing alone?" Creepy as fuck. I just ignored him and walked towards the back of the store. He yelled after me and called me a bitch. I still ignored him. I figured he was drunk or high or just an asshole. Most people around here talk a big game, but rarely back it up. I wasn't scared, just annoyed. I got my snacks and paid at the counter. When I walked back up to the door, both men were gone. I was happy to not have to deal with any more catcalling. I began walking across the lot towards my car, which was probably about 100 feet away from the door. As I was walking, I looked down at my phone to see if enough time had passed for my brother to be at my parents'. When I looked up, the asshole who had hit on me earlier was standing at the pumps staring. I looked at him for a second and continued walking. "Hey, you know you're supposed to answer a man when he speaks to you, right?" he said. I remember saying something snarky back to him and getting in my car. He looked pissed at my sarcasm. I locked my doors as soon as I was in my car, started it, and realized the man had disappeared. I looked around before pulling out of my parking spot only to realize that both men were sitting in a car facing mine across the lot. They were both staring at me and talking, occasionally even pointing towards me. I just stared at them, defiant and pissed. I didn't want them to think that I was scared. While we were sitting there having our staring contest, the man who had opened the door for me smiled and gave me the finger across the throat gesture, as in, "You're dead." I rolled my eyes and pulled out of the gas station annoyed. To my dismay, they pulled out behind me. I hadn't been scared up until that point, because, as I said, most people here are a lot of talk with no follow through. Instead of going home, I took a few back roads that connect back into a sort of a circle to see if they were really following me, which of course they were. When they realized I was testing them, they drove up really close to me and started laying on the horn. I couldn't see their headlights, they were so close. I called my brother and told him what was going on. He told me to come home straight and that he would handle it. So I started to drive home. The two assholes were still on my ass blowing the horn. Even with detours, I was only about 3 or 4 minutes from my parents' house. I slowed down to pull in the driveway and was immediately relieved. At the end of the driveway, my brother was standing there, shirtless, with his shoulders back, hands crossed in front of his stomach, clearly holding a pistol. His intimidating pit bull sitting by his side. I drove around him into the yard, and the two guys actually started to pull into the driveway behind me until they saw my brother. Then they hightailed it out of there. I have no idea what they would have done if I had stopped somewhere alone or kept driving. I always think fondly of that image of him standing there like a badass, ready to protect me. I'm thankful he was there.